this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Wasabi is purpose-built to free your business from skyrocketing storage costs and fees. Wasabi is the go-to provider for professional and collegiate sports teams around the world. Check out Wasabi's AI-enabled intelligent media storage, Wasabi Air, to the industry's only cloud storage service with triple protection against cyber criminals. Wasabi, driving innovation in data storage for up to 80% less than market competition. Try for free at wasabi.com. Wasabi Hot Cloud Storage, proud partner of the iHeart Podcast Network.
You know how it's never really about where you're going, it's about who you're going with? The right people can turn any drive into a great memory. That's something Toyota really believes. They design vehicles around real life and real people, the ones who make plans happen and bring everyone together. Inside, everything's built with passengers in mind. Comfortable seating, smart layouts, and space that actually works so everyone can relax and enjoy the ride. There's room for the people, room for the stuff, and room for the moments that happen along the way. Because when people are the destination, your ride is important. Learn more at Toyota.com and find the vehicle that fits your people.
This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this episode 1086 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. All of you have heard me talk about draft capital on this show, especially this time of year. When it comes to the ZAP model, when it comes to forecasting prospects at the next level, draft capital is the single most important input to consider. And there's a lot of reasons for that. For one, better players generally get drafted earlier. NFL teams, they might be stupid sometimes, but they're spending millions and millions of dollars in an attempt to find the right prospect at each draft pick. They're clearly going to be better at picking those players than most. But also, when a team makes an investment, that player is likely going to have more immediate opportunity, or opportunity in general. When we're playing fantasy football, volume is everything. And if that player has higher draft capital, there's a higher likelihood to see that volume. Now, clearly it's not that simple. But those are two key reasons as to why draft capital gets the signal that it does in models. And it's why it's important. But with all that being said, with all this talk about draft capital being the thing that we should care about most, you probably think that it's close to the only thing to care about. But that's not the case at all. On today's episode, the truth about draft capital, why it's important, but why it's not everything. Now, before I get to the analysis, I wanted to send a quick reminder about the Late Round Prospect Guide. It's launching in less than a week. The guide is over 170 pages that covers everything that goes into ZAP models. There's rankings, there's prospect profile write-ups for every running back, wide receiver, and tight end at the combine. There's year 2 profile write-ups for the guys entering their second season in the NFL, and more. You can still pre-order it right now for $14.99 over on lateround.com. In 6 days, that's going to rise to $19.99. So get on that, lateround.com. To help explain the truth about draft capital, I, of course, went into the ZAP Models database. That database has every running back, wide receiver, and now tight end who is either drafted or at the NFL Combine since 2011. As I talked about on last week's mailbag episode, the ZAP model looks to predict a player's B2S, or his best 2 seasons in PPR points per game across his first 3 years in the league. Minimum 7 games played in a season for it to count, and it throws out the final week of the regular season. So we're only looking at fantasy relevant games. To wrap your head around B2S, imagine a running back scored 10, 12, and 14 PPR points per game over his first 3 years, and he never missed a game. His B2S would be 13. It would average his best 2 seasons of 12 and 14. That's what the ZAP model is attempting to forecast. It's trying to predict which players will score highest in B2S. And it gives a player some prospect score, a ZAP score, to help with that. Now, I bring that up because when talking about how important draft capital is, B2S is how I'm going to measure that importance. You can do this in a ton of different ways. Best season PPR points per game across his first 3 years. How many top 12, top 24 seasons the player had. I just do it via B2S. And since B2S features 3 seasons of data, on today's show, I'm looking at players who were drafted from 2011 through 2023. That way they've had a chance to play those 3 years. Now, I think it's human nature for your brain to go into this linear mode when we talk about draft capital, Maybe not totally linear, but let me explain what I mean. You hear someone say a wide receiver was drafted 16th overall. Then you compare that player to someone who went 32nd overall. And then you compare a third player who went 48th overall. Those are all wide receivers who went 16 picks, one after another. There were 16 selections between each pick. But performance versus draft capital doesn't behave in a linear way. For running backs and wide receivers, the positions that we're going to focus on today, it's a downward slope where the first part of the first round, that slope is really steep. But then it starts to level out. And at some points, draft capital is actually completely irrelevant. Now, I want to start with running back first because, quite frankly, it's an easier position to model in general compared to wide receiver. When it comes to big investments at running back in the draft, they almost always give us good fantasy production, which is why if Jeremiah Love's draft capital just keeps going up, he's actually going to end up in the legendary performer category in the model this year. I didn't think that was going to happen at first. But we know that top half of the first round running backs have been unreal over the last 15 or so years in fantasy football. Since 2011, here are the guys drafted in the top 16. Trent Richardson, Melvin Gordon, Todd Gurley, Ezekiel Elliott, Christian McCaffrey, Leonard Fournette, Saquon Barkley, Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, and Ashton Genty, and probably Jeremiah Love. All of those guys scored roughly 17 PPR points per game or more in one of their first 3 seasons, except Genty, who's only played 1 season. Even Trent Richardson got there as a rookie. Needless to say, it's not surprising that when you look at the correlation between draft capital and B2S for first-round running backs, there's decent correlation. But let's take a step backwards first. Like I said, this database has every running back who was at the NFL Combine or drafted since 2011. Anyone who goes undrafted just gets a default draft capital of undrafted. Their draft pick is all the same. The R squared between draft capital, their raw pick, and B2S is about 0.45, which means draft capital explains roughly 45% of the variance in B2S outcomes across this entire sample, which is fairly strong correlation for fantasy football purposes. But that's across the whole sample. I made a thread on Twitter last week about prospecting through data, and one of the things that I brought up in that thread was R squared analysis. You hear data people like myself talk about R squared all the time, and people will email me or hit me up and they're like, hey JJ, what's the R squared of your model? Now, for those of you who think I'm speaking a different language right now, R squared, it's a statistical measure that tells us how much of the variation in one variable can be explained by another variable. When R squared is 1, it means it can explain everything. When it's 0, it means there's no linear relationship between those two variables. So in this case, we're looking at draft capital versus B2S. So we're seeing how much of the variation in a player's NFL production can be explained by a variable. In this case, that variable is draft capital. But people will say, hey JJ, what's the R squared of your model? And my answer is, that doesn't matter without context. If I tell you that the R squared for my model is 0.42, you might be like, oh, that's actually not that bad. But actually, that's really bad because that's worse than the R squared of just plain old draft capital. And anyone can improve that R squared by adding certain data points. For example, if I removed all undrafted players, the R squared between draft capital and B2S lowers to about 0.39. Now, just so we're all on the same page, think about why that might be the case. It's because I'm removing a bunch of undrafted players who are almost definitely going to do nothing in the NFL, which means they have super late draft capital, they're undrafted, and B2Ss of 0, 1, maybe 2 points. That improves your correlation when they're in the data set. Having the undrafted players in the model improves that correlation. If you change that sample, then R squared changes. For example, first round running backs. I told you that top half first round running backs have been really good since 2011, and they have. That means if the back half of the first round has crappier running backs, then we'll see some sort of correlation for first round running backs when looking at draft capital versus B2S, right? And that's exactly what we see. When looking only at first round running backs since 2011, the R squared between where they were drafted and how they performed in B2S has been 0.56, which is stronger than all of these running backs when you look at round 1 through the undrafted guys. And that should hint to us that later first round running backs might not be that productive, or I should say they've seen a dip in production compared to the guys drafted in the front half of the first round. Because if they were just as productive, the correlation for first round running backs wouldn't be very strong. As you'd expect, as you move through the draft round by round, that correlation weakens. Running back is really top heavy. The top guys at the position are doing so much work. They're almost always hitting. Round 2 running backs since 2011, they've had an R squared of 0.16, round 3, 0.11. And as you approach day 3, you start to get into numbers that are essentially just non-existent, where you can just throw out draft capital and just pick who you want. You can choose 2 endpoints here to make your story, to create that narrative. Like for instance, if you look at running backs picked between picks 17 and 50 since 2011 through 2023, we've had 25 of them. You know what the correlation between draft capital and B2S among those 25 running backs is? Again, pick 17 to pick 50. It's 0.002. That's non-existent correlation. What that tells you is that historically, there hasn't been much of a difference in production for running backs drafted mid-round 1 through mid-round 2. But if you add in those top 16 running backs, whoa, all of a sudden, that equation changes. Because remember, those guys are doing a lot of the heavy lifting. The R squared goes from non-existent to very existent. It shifts to 0.25 with 34 running backs now in the sample. Like I said, you can pick and choose your endpoints here. Like for instance, pick 33 through pick 100, essentially day 2 picks. The R squared, 0.07. That's not very strong at all. Pick 50 to pick 100, the R squared is 0.00, non-existent. It doesn't matter. Now, this isn't to say that draft capital is irrelevant for those players. All things being equal, you'd still probably want the player who goes earlier in the draft. And again, I'm just choosing endpoints here. You can capture different players at different draft capitals and make it say one thing or another. But one thing here is super clear. The further you move through the draft, the less draft capital matters. Now, another way to approach this topic is through binning. We can just take all the round 2 running backs and group them together, and then we can do the exact same thing with round 3 running backs. And then we can just compare those 2 groups. And I think that's probably the analysis that you see most. And there's a chance that it's contradicting what you're currently hearing me talk about. But it's not, because binning does a different job than R squared analysis does. R squared is saying, how smooth does production shift from one draft pick to another? When we're binning, the group of players within that bin can still be pretty chaotic. Like if we were to compare round 2 to round 3 players, that means that we're looking at all players drafted between pick 33 and 64, and we're grouping them together. But the players within that group could produce in wildly different ways. Like a player picked 64th can outperform a player picked 33rd. But when they're binned together, that's not discovered when we group them up, because they're all just one group. When you approach this type of analysis via binning, you'll likely find some differences. For instance, the average B2S among round 2 running backs has been about 10.7. For round 3 guys, it falls to 9.6. That's not amazingly significant, but it's significant enough. Meanwhile, running backs get 14 or more PPR points in B2S at a 35% rate out of round 2. Out of round 3, that's 22%. They get to 12 or more points at a 44% rate versus a 27% rate. You get the picture. In general, a player drafted in round 2 is going to be better than a player drafted in round 3. But those are also pretty arbitrary thresholds. And far too often, way too often, you get people looking at players who are 15 to 20 picks apart, and they automatically put that better draft capital player ahead in their rankings. And it's because of draft capital. But realistically, it's not that significant in the grand scheme of things. Really, the takeaway here is that draft capital works more in tiers than it does as a precise ranking system. Because when you treat draft capital too literally, you end up viewing pick 64 as meaningfully better than pick 65. And when you look at the R squared among day 2 running backs, it tells us that production in that range is far more random than that. And then as you get to day 3, there's some correlation that does exist, picks 100 plus to the end of the draft. It's about 0.15, which does mean a 4th rounder, for instance, has a little bit more likelihood to hit than a 7th rounder. But when you get into round 5, round 6, there's really no difference between those types of players and a round 7 running back. The TLDR here is that the top of running back draft classes often are doing the heavy lifting when it comes to draft capital being a huge point of emphasis. You should almost blindly follow and just draft top half of the first round running backs because they hit at such a ridiculous rate in fantasy. After that, don't be too certain about players. Make sure you're looking deeper than just draft capital. Even at running back, where I think the consensus believes that draft capital is absolutely tied to production no matter what. That's just not the case. Now, the same general trends can be found at wide receiver, except it's not as clear cut. It's a little bit more wild, wild west. Across the entire sample of players, we see an R squared of 0.48. Technically, that's better than what we see at running back. Again, that's looking at all round one through undrafted players since 2011. But there's a lot more nuance to the wide receiver stuff. Remember how first round running backs saw really strong correlation because the top of the position has just been so good? Well, since 2011, that hasn't been the case at wide receiver. The R squared for first round wideouts is just 0.08. Late first wideouts have been decent compared to early first round ones. Now, fortunately, it seems like teams have gotten a little bit better about this in recent years, but it's still not nearly as strong as it is at running back. When running backs get drafted early, they almost always produce. There's literally zero correlation for round 2 wide receivers. And then it's the same for round 3. And when you combine the two, the R squared is 0.05, which at face value tells you that there's very little correlation when it comes to day 2 wide receivers in general. With that being said, round 2 wide receivers do outperform round 3 wide receivers. Their B2S is about 2.3 points higher. They hit 10, 12, and 14 PPR points in B2S at higher rates across the board. But those rates aren't unbelievably significant. And the average for the round 2 guys, it usually comes down to floor rather than ceiling. And in fantasy football, ceiling is typically the thing that we're chasing. But this continues to play into this idea that draft capital isn't linear. And round selection is still relatively arbitrary. Just because a player goes 33rd overall doesn't mean that you should take him in your rookie draft no matter what over someone who goes 53rd overall. In fact, this data is telling you that there historically hasn't been that much of a difference between those two players at wide receiver. Now, the interesting thing is when you look at draft capital from 2011 to 2023 and you find the R squared for players drafted in the top 100 versus B2S, and then players drafted on day 3, which I'm just signaling as anyone drafted after pick 100 because it's just cleaner. Keep in mind, for all drafted players, that R squared is 0.39. Very similar to running back. We're removing the undrafted guys. But for top 100 picks at running back, draft slot explains roughly 50% more of the B2S variance than it does at wide receiver. Meaning running back correlation with top 100 picks is much, much stronger. And that shouldn't be that surprising because of what running back is doing in the top half of the first round. Now, to be fair, things have gotten a little bit better at wide receiver during the 2018 to 2023 timeframe within that range. Things have gotten a little bit better. But the reason the wide receiver correlation across the entire sample is just as strong as it is at running back, but it's so much weaker with top 100 picks, is because wide receiver is not very good on day 3. Day 3 running backs at least will give us something a little bit more frequently. That can add more variance to the R squared analysis. But you'll often get a lot of zeros from day 3 wide receivers. And when guys hit, they'll typically really hit, but there's not enough of them to really drive down that R squared. But look, we've talked a lot about these different areas of the draft and R squared and binning. What am I really getting at here? Well, I think people need to know that while draft capital is really, really important, if you're choosing between two players who are in the vicinity of one another, don't let draft capital overtake your decision making. The NFL is better at identifying tiers than ranking players within those tiers. Teams can identify which players belong in some draft range, but the exact order of those players is actually really, really noisy. So if you like a player who was picked 54th overall more than a player who was picked 34th overall, go with the guy who was picked 54th overall in your rookie draft. Not only is it more fun to follow your own evaluations, but math actually backs you up with that move. Realistically, small draft capital differences are usually meaningless. A 15 to 20 pick difference inside the same tier historically hasn't explained much about player outcomes. And keep in mind, round boundaries They're pretty arbitrary. Pick 33 versus pick 35 versus pick 40 versus pick 50. They all often behave more similarly than the round 2 or round 3 labels imply, which is precisely why I've always used raw draft pick within the ZAP model. Now look, if you want this position by position, I'd say the following. Top half of the first round running backs, they're extremely safe bets, and they drive a large portion of the draft capital's predictiveness power at the position. Running back really starts to flatten after that top 16, top 20 range. Meanwhile, at wide receiver, the evaluation with draft capital is a little bit looser. Day 2 wide receivers often behave like a large talent pool rather than some ranked list. You should generally prefer a player drafted in round 2 versus round 3. But again, you don't need to force the issue with arbitrary thresholds. Great wide receivers, they're found throughout day 2. Lead with your analysis. You shouldn't just rank these guys based on draft capital, because it's not nearly as linear as you think. And that's just the truth. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Late Round QB. I'll be back on Wednesday live on YouTube with a new Late Round Fantasy Football show, and it's just me. I'm doing a solo show because David Kitchen is gone this week on vacation. After that, later in the week, I've got a Late Round Perspectives episode for you guys. Thanks for listening. Greatly appreciate all of you. I'll talk to you soon.
Wasabi is purpose-built to free your business from skyrocketing storage costs and fees. Wasabi is the go-to provider for professional and collegiate sports teams around the world. Check out Wasabi's AI-enabled intelligent media storage, Wasabi Air, to the industry's only cloud storage service with triple protection against cyber criminals. Wasabi, driving innovation in data storage for up to 80% less than market competition. Try for free at wasabi.com. Wasabi Hot Cloud Storage, proud partner of the iHeart Podcast Network.
I'm Daniel Jeremiah.
And I am Greg Rosenthal.
I know that, Greg. We're teaming up on 40s and Free Agents, the podcast that owns the NFL offseason.
This is where teams are built. Free agency, the combine, pro days, trades. Every move matters.
From my draft boards and mock drafts
to my vaunted top 101 free agents and how rosters come together.
Quarterback movement,
surprise signings.
We'll tell you what it means and who really wins.
Open your free iHeart Radio app, search 40s and Free Agents, and listen now.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed Human.